Are we winning the war on terror? Today on The Realist. Now, in case you guys don't know, I have done many episodes, particularly history episodes, detailing the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan. And so if you're interested on this topic about the United States war on terror, whatever that means, go back and I encourage you, watch all of those episodes where I get into the nitty-gritty about the US's war in these different regions, what they did well, and crucially, what they didn't do so well. Today, I just want to take a step back and ask the question, is the United States winning the war on terror? Well, to start, let me give you guys just a few metrics, a few statistics to throw out there to get some context for what we're talking about. When Al-Qaeda attacked the United States on 9/11, estimates put that there were approximately 200 to 1,000 at the very most members of Al-Qaeda. Now, there were more people training at Al-Qaeda training camps, but most of them were being trained to fight in Afghanistan for the Taliban or in Kashmir area for Pakistan. So 9/11 happens, you have between 200 and 1,000 members. Today, 15, 16 years later, estimates put Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda affiliated and inspired terrorist groups at between 40,000 and 65,000. Now, this includes ISIS, which it's my belief that you can make a causal connection between Al-Qaeda and ISIS, even though recently they have had a divorce, shall we say, citing irreconcilable differences. I won't get into that, but I think an argument can be made that you would not have ISIS without Al-Qaeda. And if you want to see that argument, go back to one of my episodes in Iraq where I talked about Abu Musab al-Zarqawi and how he came out of Al-Qaeda and how he was sort of the forerunner of ISIS. All right, so how much money did Al-Qaeda spend on the 9/11 operation? Most people say they spent about $500,000, $500,000. Now, what are the estimates of how much money the U.S. has spent on the war on terror since 9/11? Well, estimates between the financial devastation that 9/11 caused on the markets, the physical damage that has caused, the damage to the military of the United States, the damage to how much money the United States is going to have to pay in health care for wounded veterans and ongoing health care, all of these things and more, people put the estimate at about $3 trillion. If I told you, give me an initial investment of $500,000, and I will give you $3 trillion 15 years later, would most of you take that bet? I'm guessing, because you're rational, most of you would take that bet. I'll tell you what, I'd take that bet. If you told me I can give you $500,000 and I'm going to get $3 trillion in return, I'm taking that bet. So to really understand the question, is the U.S. winning the war on terror? I think it's really apropos to ask the question, what was Al-Qaeda, what was Osama bin Laden's goal in starting and doing the 9/11 attack? What was their goal as an organization? Al-Qaeda's goal, Osama bin Laden's goal, was ultimately to drag the United States into a war in Afghanistan, much like the Soviet Union was dragged into a war in Afghanistan, and basically wear them down over years and years of insurgency-type fighting so that, and this is the key, the United States would disengage from the Muslim world. So if you go back and you look at why Osama bin Laden throughout his history became more and more upset and angered at the U.S., it wasn't because of what the United States is. It's not because we're a democracy. It's not because we let women work in the workplace. That's not ultimately the reason why Al-Qaeda and other terrorist networks hate America. They hate America because of its support for Israel. They hate America because it has, particularly Osama hates America, because it had United States troops based on Muslim lands in Saudi Arabia, on the Gulf Peninsula. And the last and probably the most important reason why Al-Qaeda hated the United States was because of the United States' support of authoritarian regimes in the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia, like Egypt. Al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations, ultimately their goal, like ISIS has made very explicit, is to establish a caliphate, an Islamic state. That's their goal, and they see these authoritarian dictatorships propped up by the United States' support, either directly or indirectly, as a hindrance to that. And so if they can remove the United States' support from these regimes, if they can remove United States support from Israel, if they can remove their footprint in the region, that's a victory. And so interestingly, the United States did go to war in Afghanistan, and as I detailed in my episodes on Afghanistan, the first few years, the United States did amazingly. They did a great job, and you can actually read from some of the interrogations of Al-Qaeda members in those early days. They were not expecting the United States to attack and be so successful in the early days of the Afghanistan war. However, then the greatest gift George W. Bush ever gave Osama bin Laden was his invasion of Iraq, right? Because Afghanistan isn't based in the Middle East, it's in South Asia. George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, and Donald Rumsfeld thought, you know what, why don't we invade a Middle Eastern Muslim country right in the heart of the action? And this was just, as a silver plate for Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, because then what the United States does is it makes all of the Muslim world angry at the United States for invading Muslim territory and trying to, basically in their eyes, imperially establish their democratic political system. That is just, if you wanted to create anger and incite a revolution and incite violence against the United States, you could not have done something any better from Al-Qaeda's point of view. And as a result, both the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan suffered greatly. The United States, for all intents and purposes, I can't think you could say that the United States won. I mean, right now, currently, after 16 years, almost 16 years of fighting in Afghanistan, the Taliban today, as I'm speaking, hold more ground in Afghanistan than they have at any time since 9/11. So you can't really call that a victory. Most strategists say at this point the United States would just settle for a tie with the Taliban, which I don't think is ever going to happen. The Taliban are going to fight forever until they kick the Americans out, reestablish their governance. In Iraq, really can't say that's much of a success. I mean, the U.S. went in, knocked down Saddam Hussein, and now basically instead of a united Iraq under the admittedly authoritarian dictator Saddam Hussein, you basically have a fractured Iraq. You have Shia, Iran-leaning southern Iraq, you have eastern Sunnistan under ISIS, and you have the northern Kurdish region. It's not a unified Iraq. And crucially, what the United States actually did by invading Iraq is they actually helped their number one enemy, their number one foe in the region, which is Iran. Historically, Iran's greatest nemesis was Iraq. I mean, they fought a war for 8 or 9 years in which over 1 million people died in the 1980s between each other. So the United States says, we don't like Iran, so what are you going to do? Well, I think the obvious thing to do is to go in and topple their number one enemy and let Iran actually have a bigger foothold and influence over Iraq. Not a good idea. And so where does this leave us today as far as America's image in the world? Well, not only was the war in Iraq extremely unpopular around the world, but the U.S. engaged in a number of different policies that have made it even more unpopular, and that some people, like former President Jimmy Carter have said, have actually tarnished America's ability to claim moral authority in international relations. So you've had different scandals like the Abu Ghraib prison scandal, the torture scandal, the rendition program to black sites, the encroachment onto civil liberties that leaks like Edward Snowden's has shown to the world that America is willing to go a little bit farther than maybe it originally thought it would to not protect civil liberties in order to ensure security. All these things have served to undermine the moral authority and the credibility of the United States. And lastly, has the United States been less willing to intervene and to get involved in Middle Eastern affairs? Well, if you want a case in point of this, look at Syria. Syria was ripe for U.S. intervention. It was actually much worse than what Iraq was when we invaded Iraq in 2003. I mean, think of where Syria was today and where it was in 2011, 2012, 2013. Where they had actually used chemical weapons, where there's a civil war that's killed over 500,000 people, where there's internally displaced people of over 8 million, and many more millions have actually fled the country. I mean, if there was ever a situation in the history of the last 60 years of United States foreign policy that warranted intervention, it was the Syrian civil war. And yet, President Barack Obama, for I think good reasons, admirable reasons, said, no, we're not going to get militarily involved. That, I think, is a win for Al-Qaeda and the terrorist organizations, because who has profited the most from the Syrian civil war? It's terrorist organizations. It's organizations like ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra, formerly known as Jabhat al-Nusra. And so when you go through these lists of effects of the war on terror, it seems to me that at least you can't say the United States is winning the war on terrorism. However, there is one caveat. If the only goal of the war on terror was to make sure that the United States wasn't attacked in the homeland of America by an outside terrorist group. Then, only then, could you probably make the argument that the war on terror was successful to some degree because it has prevented an outside attack on the United States. It's successfully defended against that. Yes, there have been attacks by people in the United States, but the vast majority of them have been homegrown, self-radicalized, lone wolf types of attacks. That's not the same as what 9/11 was, which was planned overseas, infiltration into America, and then the attack ensues. Alright guys, so what do you think about the war on terror? Are there things that I have conveniently left out of this argument so as to bolster my own position? If there are, what are they? Has America actually done better than what I've described? I'm open to criticism. I'm open to a new point of view, but from my perspective, the United States, you can at least say that the United States isn't winning. I don't know if it's completely lost, but I don't think it's won. And you can look at Afghanistan, the longest war, and it's not even close in U.S. history, going on now this year for 16 years. You can look at the situation in Iraq, you can look at the fragmentation of Syria and the Middle East in general, the heightened sectarian tensions in the region. I don't know if the United States is actually winning the war on terror. Over to you guys. Comment below, let me know, tell me what you think, share the video, subscribe to the channel, and remember guys, reality always trumps ideology.